Behind locked doors, a tycoon hides a fortress and a fatal secret. Welcome to the Silent Clue Works. I am your host, Echo of Silence. Comment where you're listening from. Your voices matter. Let's step quietly into tonight's mystery. It was 10 minutes past 11 on a Tuesday morning when the doorbell rang, and I knew from the sound that whoever was pressing it had never learned the difference between ringing and attacking. I was in the office, pretending to balance the checkbook while actually wondering if Nero Wolfe would emerge from the plant rooms before the orchids started charging rent. The balance was looking as healthy as a 3-day-old fish, which meant we needed a client with deep pockets and shallow scruples, or at least one who paid promptly. I went to the front door and peered through the one-way glass. The man on the stoop looked like he had been assembled from premium materials by a committee of engineers. He wore a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than my car, and his face had the kind of tan you get from weekends in places that require passports. His eyes were pale gray, the color of expensive steel, and when he looked at the door, it was with the expression of a man who expected it to open itself out of respect. I opened it. He didn't smile, nod, or acknowledge that I was anything more than a minor obstacle between him and his destination. "I need to see Nero Wolfe," he said. Not wanted, not hoped, but needed, as if Wolfe were a prescription drug he had to have filled. "Mr. Wolfe is engaged," I told him. "If you want to make an appointment, I can check his schedule, but it's pretty full through the next ice age." He reached into his coat and produced a card. It was cream-colored stock, thick enough to use as armor, with a name embossed in letters that looked like they had been carved by someone who took pride in his work. Marcus Thorne. Below it, in smaller script, Chairman, Thorne Industries. I knew the name. Everybody in New York knew the name. Thorne had made a fortune in data encryption, then spent half of it trying to disappear from public view. The newspapers called him the Invisible Billionaire, which was the kind of nickname that stuck whether you liked it or not. "I'll see if Mr. Wolfe is available," I said, and led him to the front room. He sat in the red leather chair like he was conducting a board meeting, back straight, hands folded, eyes taking inventory of everything in sight. I went to the kitchen where Fritz was doing something complicated with mushrooms and used the house phone to call upstairs. Wolfe answered on the 4th ring, which meant he was annoyed at being interrupted but not quite ready to declare war. "Yes? Marcus Thorne is here, the encryption king. He looks like he's used to getting his way and doesn't plan to change the habit today." There was a pause. Wolfe knows money when he smells it, even over the phone. "Bring him to the office at 11:30. The line went dead. I went back to the front room and told Thorne he had 20 minutes to wait. He checked a watch that looked like it could run a small spacecraft, nodded once, and picked up a magazine without looking at it. At 11:30 sharp, I heard the elevator descending. Wolfe entered the office, crossed to his desk, and settled into his chair like a mountain, finding its proper place in the landscape. He arranged a spray of cattleyas in the vase on his desk, then looked at me with the expression of a man who had been forced to interrupt important business for the sake of commerce. I brought Thorne in. He took one look at Wolfe and stopped, which most people do. Wolfe is not just large. He's monumental, and when he's behind that desk with his eyes half closed and his massive frame filling the custom-made chair, he looks like a Buddha who has decided to take a personal interest in your problems for reasons you will never understand. "Mr. Thorne," Wolfe said. "Sit down." Thorne sat. He looked at Wolfe with the expression of a man who was used to being the most important person in any room and was discovering that the rules had changed. "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Wolfe. I have a problem that requires discretion and, I'm told, the kind of mind that can solve impossible puzzles." Wolfe's eyes opened a fraction. Impossible is a word I use sparingly. "Proceed." Thorne leaned forward. "I live in a penthouse that I've spent 10 years making absolutely secure. Biometric scanners, pressure-sensitive floors, dedicated air supply. the works. Inside that penthouse, I have a private vault. Steel walls, electronic locks, no windows, no vents. Yesterday morning, I opened that vault. Nothing was missing, but something had been added. Sitting on the table in the center of the room was a single white gardenia, fresh cut, as if it had been placed there moments before. Wolfe poured beer from the bottle Fritz had brought. "You're certain the vault was sealed?" "Completely. The security logs show the door remaining closed for 48 hours. No alarms, no system failures, no record of entry. It's impossible, Mr. Wolfe, but it happened." Wolfe sipped his beer and regarded Thorne with the look of a man who had just been presented with a puzzle worthy of his attention. "Someone is sending you a message, Mr. Thorne. The question is not how they did it, but why, and more importantly, who." He named his fee. Thorne didn't flinch. The game was afoot, and for once, the enemy wasn't a man with a gun, but a ghost with a flower. Thorne didn't flinch at the fee. He wrote a check with the casual efficiency of a man paying for groceries, though the amount would keep the brownstone running for months. After he left, promising to send complete security documentation within the hour, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence. His eyes were closed. His lips pushing in and out in the rhythm I'd learned meant he was arranging facts like pieces on a chessboard. I knew better than to interrupt, so I studied the architectural drawings Thorne had left behind, trying to make sense of a penthouse designed like a medieval fortress. When Wolfe finally opened his eyes, he looked at me with the expression of a man who had just realized his afternoon beer was going to be delayed by unpleasant necessities. "Archie, this is theatrical nonsense disguised as a security breach. Someone with intimate access is playing an elaborate game, and Mr. Thorne either knows who or suspects strongly enough to require confirmation before taking action. We are being hired not to solve a mystery, but to provide cover for a decision already made." "You took his money anyway," I pointed out. "I took his money because the alternative was reviewing Fritz's grocery receipts with you, which would have been considerably more painful. Also, gardenias are not indigenous to sealed vaults. Someone expended considerable effort to deliver a message that could have been conveyed by telephone. That suggests emotion, and emotion invariably leads to carelessness." The doorbell rang with the aggressive persistence of someone who expected immediate attention. I found a courier holding a manila envelope thick enough to contain either vital evidence or someone's complete life history. Inside were security logs printed in fonts designed to discourage human comprehension, floor plans that looked like blueprints for a space station, and a typed list of personnel with access to Thorne's penthouse. Wolfe examined the list with the careful attention he usually reserved for orchid catalogs. Mr. Thorne employs a household staff of 4, plus his security chief. His personal assistant, Vanessa Croy, has worked for him 8 years and handles his correspondence. His security chief, Derek Moss, former military intelligence, oversees all physical access. His housekeeper, Maria Santos, maintains the living quarters and has keys to most areas. His chef, Anton Belmar, formerly of a 3-star restaurant in Lyon, prepares all meals and manages the kitchen. Finally, his driver, Paul Hendricks, who has been with the family since Mr. Thorne was a teenager. I whistled softly. That's a lot of people with access to a man who supposedly lives like a hermit. Indeed, and one of them placed a gardenia in a sealed vault to communicate something Mr. Thorne finds threatening enough to engage my services immediately. The flower is significant. Gardenias symbolize purity, secret love, or, in certain contexts, a warning of impending betrayal. Mr. Thorne is unmarried, maintains no known romantic attachments, and lives entirely for his work. Therefore, the flower represents a warning, and the method of delivery demonstrates that his security is illusory. So someone on the inside wants him to know they can reach him whenever they choose. Classic intimidation. Wolfe nodded slowly. Or preparation for something considerably worse. Mr. Thorne did not strike me as easily frightened. Yet he appeared here within hours of discovering the intrusion. That suggests urgency born of knowledge we do not yet possess. The telephone's shrill ring interrupted his analysis. I answered and immediately recognized Thorne's voice, though it carried an edge that hadn't been there during his visit. The controlled businessman was showing cracks. "Mr. Goodwin, I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe immediately." "There's been another incident." I transferred the call. Wolfe listened without speaking for nearly 2 minutes, his expression growing progressively darker. When he finally responded, his voice carried the soft menace of distant thunder. "When did this occur?" Another pause, while he absorbed information that clearly displeased him. "Touch nothing. Allow no one to enter that room. Mr. Goodwin will be there within the hour." He replaced the receiver and fixed me with a stare. "Someone has entered the vault again. This time they left a knife embedded in the table where the gardenia was placed. There is a note attached, which Mr. Thorne declined to read over the telephone. He described it only as making the situation considerably more complicated." I was already reaching for my coat. "What kind of knife?" "From his kitchen. His chef noticed it missing this morning but assumed it had been misplaced. The intruder is not merely demonstrating access now, but escalating to direct threat." 20 minutes later, I stood in Thorne's penthouse, which occupied the entire top floor of a building that looked like it had been designed to intimidate visiting dignitaries. The living spaces were sterile and expensive, decorated with the warmth of a high-end morgue. Thorne led me through rooms that felt more like museum displays than places where humans actually lived. The vault door stood open, revealing the knife driven deep into the wooden table. It was an ordinary kitchen blade, nothing exotic, but the force required to embed it so deeply suggested either considerable strength or significant anger. A folded note was taped around the handle. I extracted it carefully with my handkerchief, unfolded it, and read the message typed in block capitals. "Your walls keep secrets in but cannot keep justice out. What you stole will be returned. The reckoning begins now." Thorne watched my face as I read. "Well, somebody's definitely not sending flowers anymore," I said. "This is personal, Mr. Thorne. Someone believes you've wronged them, and they're done being subtle about it. The question is what you stole and from whom." His jaw tightened, and for the first time since I'd met him, Marcus Thorne looked like a man who was genuinely afraid. Not of the knife, but of what it represented. Someone had declared war on his carefully constructed world, and the first shot had been fired in the one place he'd believed was absolutely secure. "We need to talk to your staff," I said. "All of them. Starting now." Thorne gathered his staff in the penthouse's main sitting room, a space that managed to be both expensive and sterile, like a museum display of how wealthy people were supposed to live. They assembled with the cautious efficiency of people who understood that their employers' moods could affect their employment status, each maintaining careful distance from the others while trying to look appropriately concerned about whatever crisis had disrupted their Tuesday routine. I positioned myself by the window where I could watch all their faces, notebook ready, while Thorne stood behind me like a general addressing troops he suspected might include a traitor. The dynamic was clear. This was his fortress, and these were his subjects, but someone in this room had turned the natural order upside down. Vanessa Croy arrived first, moving with the brisk confidence of someone who had managed crises before breakfast. She was mid-30s, dark hair pulled back with military precision, wearing a gray suit that suggested she meant business and expected everyone else to follow suit. Her eyes were sharp and calculating, the kind that missed nothing and filed everything for future reference. When she sat, she crossed her legs and folded her hands with the precision of someone performing a familiar ritual. But I caught her glancing toward the vault corridor with an expression I couldn't quite read. Derek Moss entered next, and the room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. "Former military" was written in every line of his posture, from the way he automatically scanned for exits to how he positioned himself with clear sight lines to everyone present. He was maybe 45, built like he still ran obstacle courses for entertainment, with close-cropped hair and eyes that evaluated threats with professional detachment. He remained standing near the door, hands clasped behind his back, radiating the kind of controlled tension that comes from being responsible for security that had just been spectacularly breached. Maria Santos came in quietly, a small woman in her 50s with work-worn hands and the careful demeanor of someone who had learned to be invisible in rooms full of important people. She took a seat on the edge of a chair, as if prepared to leap up the moment someone required something, her eyes darting between Thorne and me with barely concealed nervousness. Anton Belmar followed, and even entering a room he managed to convey artistic temperament. He was tall and angular, early 40s, with the kind of sharp features that suggested French ancestry and the permanent, slight frown of someone perpetually disappointed by inferior ingredients. He wore chef's whites despite the hour, and his hands moved restlessly, as if missing the comfort of a familiar knife. Paul Hendricks was last, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who had been part of the furniture long enough to feel entitled to take his time. He was older than the others, maybe 60, with silver hair and the weathered face of a man who had spent decades behind steering wheels and in waiting rooms. He settled into a chair with a familiarity that suggested he'd been in this position before, probably during other household crises. Thorne's voice cut through the silence like his missing kitchen knife. "Mr. Goodwin is investigating a security matter on my behalf. You will answer his questions completely and honestly. This is not optional." I stepped forward, letting them get a good look at me. "Someone has been accessing Mr. Thorne's private vault. Twice in 2 days. The first time they left a gardenia. The second time they left a knife with a threatening message. The security logs say this is impossible. Reality says it happened. That means either the technology is lying, or one of you is." Moss answered first, his voice carrying the flat conviction of a man used to technology obeying orders. "The vault requires Mr. Thorne's biometric signature, fingerprint, retinal scan, and voice authentication. No one else has access. The logs show no unauthorized entry, no system failures, no anomalies." He paused, then added reluctantly, "There was a scheduled diagnostic yesterday morning, remote access from our security vendor. Routine maintenance, 10-minute window." Vanessa shifted slightly in her chair. "I authorized that diagnostic. Standard protocol, happens every month. Derek approved the timing. I filed that away for Wolfe. Anything labeled routine had a habit of turning guilty later." "Who knew about this maintenance window?" "Just Derek and myself," Vanessa said, but her eyes flicked toward the others. "Though the scheduling notification goes to the household management system." Anton Belmar's jaw tightened. "I spend my time in the kitchen, not monitoring computer schedules. My concern is cuisine, not corporate espionage. But I can tell you when my knife went missing. This morning. It's a Wusthof chef's knife, part of a set I brought from my previous position. I don't misplace tools." "Who has access to your kitchen?" "Everyone, technically. Staff members come for coffee, water, whatever they need. I cannot monitor every person who enters my workspace." I turned to Maria, whose nervousness had been growing more pronounced. "You clean the penthouse. Do you ever work near the vault?" She crossed herself before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir. I clean the hallway. But I've never been inside the vault. Mr. Thorne, he does not allow it. But you've been near it recently." Her eyes filled with tears. 3 days ago, I heard voices. From inside the vault. Mr. Thorne was in there, but he was not alone. He was arguing with someone, shouting. The other voice was quiet, but it made my blood cold. Thorne's face flushed red. "That's impossible. I'm always alone in the vault." "Maria, you were imagining things." "No, sir," she said, shrinking back but maintaining her ground. "I heard 2 voices. I know what I heard." The room fell silent. I looked at Hendricks, who had remained quiet throughout. "You've been with Mr. Thorne the longest. What's your take?" He considered the question with the careful deliberation of someone who chose words sparingly. I've known Marcus since he was 16. In all those years, I've learned that people don't threaten him unless they believe they have nothing left to lose. This isn't random. It's personal. Thorne's composure finally cracked. That's enough, Paul. But I was already putting pieces together. The note mentioned theft, justice, and reckoning. Maria heard voices where there should have been none. Someone with intimate knowledge of the security systems had breached an impregnable vault twice. "Mr. Thorne," I said, "what exactly did you steal?" His shoulders sagged. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decade-old secret. It wasn't an object. It was code. A decryption key I acquired from a partner who subsequently disappeared. I never used it, but I kept it, and now I believe that partner has returned. The game had changed. We weren't just dealing with household staff and security breaches anymore. We were facing a ghost from the past, and ghosts are notoriously difficult to arrest. The confession hung in the air like expensive cologne in a closed elevator, overwhelming and impossible to escape. I watched the faces around the room catalogue this new information according to their individual interests and fears. Vanessa's expression shifted from professional concern to something sharper, more calculating. Moss looked like a man who had just discovered his fortress was built on quicksand. The others simply looked scared, which was probably the most honest reaction in the room. "Your partner," I said, keeping my voice level. "Let's start with a name." Thorne moved to the window, putting his back to us as if the Manhattan skyline might offer absolution for decade-old sins. "Julian Vane. We founded the company together, developed the encryption protocols that made our fortune. Julian was brilliant, unstable, and convinced that information wanted to be free. He created what he called a master key, a back door that could unlock any system we'd built. I knew it was too dangerous to exist in the wrong hands. So you made sure it stayed in the right ones," I said. "Yours." We argued for months. He wanted to release it publicly, make it open source. I wanted to control it, use it responsibly. When he threatened to publish the key regardless of my objections, I did what I had to do. I bought him out, forced him to sign agreements that prevented him from using our joint work. 6 months later, his boat was found drifting off Montauk Point. No body, but everyone assumed suicide. Vanessa spoke carefully, each word measured like ingredients in a recipe that could explode if mixed incorrectly. "In 8 years of managing your affairs, you never mentioned a co-founder. Every document, every corporate history, every biography treats Thorne Industries as your sole creation." "Because that's what it became," Thorne said, but the defensiveness in his voice undermined the claim. "Julian was gone. The company was mine. There was no reason to complicate the narrative with ancient history." I flipped through my notebook, buying time to think. Except ancient history apparently decided to complicate itself. The note mentioned stolen property being returned. If Vane is alive and back, he's not interested in corporate reconciliation. He wants his key back. Moss finally found his voice, though it carried the strained control of a man watching his professional reputation crumble in real time. "If Vane has returned and is targeting Mr. Thorne, we need to treat this as a credible security threat. The vault breaches demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of our protocols. That requires either inside assistance or access to architectural information that shouldn't exist outside this building." I looked at each staff member in turn, watching for tells. Who here knew about the original security specifications? Hendricks raised his hand slightly. "I drove Marcus to meetings with the contractors 10 years ago. Julian was involved in the initial consultations before their partnership ended." "So Vane helped design the security he's now bypassing," I said. "That explains knowledge, but not method. He still has to physically enter the vault to leave flowers and cutlery." I dismissed the staff with instructions to remain available, then spent 20 minutes with Moss reviewing security footage. The cameras showed nothing unusual, just empty corridors and sealed doors. But when we examined the maintenance window from yesterday morning, I noticed something interesting. "This diagnostic," I said, pointing at the screen. "Who authorized it?" Moss pulled up the logs. "Routine maintenance from our vendor, Secure Corp. Happens monthly, but—" He frowned, typing rapidly. "The IP address is wrong. This came through an Estonian proxy server, but it used valid authorization codes." "Your codes?" "My administrative access?" "Yes. But I didn't authorize this session." I left Moss to his electronic detective work and returned to the vault. Standing in the doorway, I tried to think like someone who needed to enter a sealed room without opening the door. The walls were steel, the floor was concrete, the ceiling was reinforced. But Maria had heard voices, and voices travel through air. I knelt beside the heavy table in the center of the room, running my hands along its base. The legs were bolted to the floor with industrial-strength hardware, but when I pressed against the carpet around them, I felt something unusual. The pile was compressed on one side, as if weight had rested there recently. I pulled out my pocket knife and probed the base of one leg. A small panel popped open, revealing a bundle of wires and a compact hydraulic mechanism. The table wasn't just furniture. It was a platform, a dumbwaiter that could lower into the space below, allowing someone to place objects on it from underneath and raise it back into position. "Mr. Thorne," I called through the open vault door. He appeared immediately, looking haggard. "What is it?" "What's directly below this room?" "The guest suite on the lower level, but it's been empty for months. No one uses it." I had him show me downstairs. The guest suite was unlocked, dusty, with the stale air of disuse. In the bedroom directly beneath the vault, I examined the ceiling. Hidden within an ornate plaster medallion was a square outline that matched the dimensions of the table base above. On the nightstand sat a laptop computer connected to a complex array of electronic equipment that had been spliced into the building's power and data systems. Next to it was a photograph. Two young men on a pier, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing. One was clearly a younger Marcus Thorne. The other had intense eyes and the kind of grin that suggested he enjoyed proving other people wrong. "Julian," Thorne whispered, sinking onto the bed as if his legs had forgotten their purpose. I picked up the photograph, noting its age and the genuine affection visible between the two men. "He's been here, under your feet, using your own security systems against you." My phone rang. Wolfe's voice carried its usual measured authority. "Archie, report." I gave him the essentials: the partner, the dumbwaiter mechanism, the hidden room. He listened without interruption, then hummed a low note of satisfaction. "Excellent work. The method is elegant, the motive is personal, and the execution demonstrates both technical skill and intimate knowledge. However, Mr. Vane is not working alone. Operating that equipment requires ongoing access to the building and detailed knowledge of current security protocols. Someone upstairs is providing assistance." "Any thoughts on who?" "Several. But first, examine that computer. Do not touch it, but observe everything. I particularly want to know about recent activity, open applications, and any documents visible on the screen." I approached the laptop carefully. The screen showed multiple windows, building schematics, security camera feeds, and what looked like financial records. But most interesting was an email program showing a recently sent message with the subject line, "Phase 2 complete." The recipient's name made my blood run cold. vcroythornin.com. Vanessa Croy wasn't just providing inside information. She was Julian Vane's partner in whatever game they were playing with her employer's life and livelihood. I stared at that email address for a full 10 seconds, letting the implications settle like sediment in disturbed water. vcroythornin.com wasn't just receiving messages from Julian Vane's electronic hideout. She was part of a correspondence that had the comfortable rhythm of ongoing collaboration. The timestamp showed the message had been sent less than an hour ago, which meant our ghost was not only alive, but actively monitoring the situation upstairs. I photographed the screen from multiple angles, making sure to capture the email headers and any visible file names in the directory. Thorne stood behind me, breathing like a man who'd just discovered his trusted physician had been slowly poisoning him. When I turned to face him, his expression had shifted from shock to something harder, more calculating. "Don't confront her yet," I said quietly. "We need to understand the full scope before we tip our hand. If Vanessa knows we've discovered her involvement, she'll warn Vane and we'll lose whatever advantage we have." My phone was already in my hand, and Wolfe answered on the second ring. I gave him the essential facts, the email, the timestamp, the clear evidence of ongoing coordination between his assistant and his supposedly dead partner. He listened without interruption, and I could picture him arranging these new pieces on his mental chessboard. "Miss Croy's involvement clarifies several matters," he said finally. "She authorized the security diagnostic, manages the household schedule, and has legitimate access to all areas of the building. The question is whether she acts from conviction or coercion. Return with Mr. Thorne immediately. I wish to explore certain biographical details he's been reluctant to discuss." An hour later, we were back in the brownstone office, Thorne settled in the red leather chair with the defeated posture of a man who'd run out of places to hide. Fritz brought beer and coffee, then vanished with his usual discretion. Wolfe poured with deliberate care, giving our client time to compose himself for what was clearly going to be an uncomfortable conversation. "Mr. Arthur Thorne," Wolfe began, his tone conversational but implacable. "You've told us about business disagreements and stolen encryption keys. What you haven't explained is why a man would spend 10 years planning elaborate revenge for what amounts to a corporate dissolution. Partners separate every day without resorting to theatrical resurrections. What else did you take from Julian Vane?" Thorne stared into his coffee as if it contained absolution instead of caffeine. "Julian had a daughter, Emily. She was 16 when he disappeared. Brilliant like her father, but unstable. After Julian's death was declared official, I became her legal guardian. Her mother had died years earlier, and Julian's will named me as Emily's caretaker. And I had her institutionalized. She was self-destructive, paranoid, convinced I'd murdered her father. The doctors agreed she was a danger to herself and others. She spent 3 years in treatment before she was stable enough for supervised release. I felt pieces clicking into place with the satisfying precision of a well-made lock. Where is Emily now? I don't know. She disappeared 4 years ago, violated her parole conditions. There was a warrant issued, but she vanished completely. Wolfe set down his beer glass with careful precision. Let me propose a hypothesis, Mr. Thorne. Julian Vane didn't die. He staged his disappearance to escape your legal constraints and begin planning his revenge. While you believed him dead, he watched you institutionalize his daughter and erase his contributions from your company's history. 4 years ago, Emily found him, or he found her. Together, they've been preparing to reclaim what they believe you stole. That's speculation, Thorne protested weakly. It's pattern recognition, Wolfe corrected. Miss Croy joined your employ 8 years ago, shortly after Emily's release from psychiatric care. A young woman with technical skills and a grievance against you would make an ideal long-term operative. The office phone rang, interrupting the revelation. I answered and heard Saul Panzer's distinctive voice, calm and precise as always. Archie, I've got information Mr. Wolfe needs to hear. It's about Miss Croy's background. I put him on speaker. Saul's report was characteristically thorough and deeply troubling. Vanessa Croy's entire professional history was fabricated, created 8 years ago by someone with serious technical expertise. Her references were real people who'd been compensated for false testimonials. Her credentials were legitimate but obtained under a previous identity that matched Emily Vane's basic biographical details. There's more, Saul continued. I traced some unusual financial activity, small, regular transfers from Thorn Industries accounts to encrypted wallets. The transactions originate from Miss Croy's workstation, but the amounts are too small and systematic to be simple embezzlement. It looks more like operational funding. Thorn stood abruptly, his composure finally cracking completely. She's been inside my life for 8 years, managing my schedule, handling my correspondence, with access to everything I've built. If she's Emily, then she's had nearly a decade to study your routines, map your security, and prepare for this moment, I finished. The question is what they want, beyond making you uncomfortable. They could have taken the encryption key by now if that was their real objective. Wolfe nodded slowly. They want acknowledgement, Mr. Thorn. Confession of your betrayal, perhaps public exposure of how you built your empire. The vault breaches are psychological preparation, designed to strip away your sense of security before demanding surrender. This is far from finished. I was already reaching for my coat. I should get back up there. If Emily's been playing Vanessa Croy for 8 years, she's not going to break character easily. But now that we know who she really is, maybe we can find the cracks. Be careful, Archie, Wolfe said. Miss Croy has had years to perfect her performance. She's dangerous precisely because she believes her cause is just, and a woman who spent 3 years in psychiatric treatment for paranoia may have learned to hide her true nature very well indeed. As I headed back into the afternoon shadows, I wondered how many other ghosts were walking around Manhattan, wearing borrowed names and nursing decade-old grievances. The invisible billionaire was about to discover that some secrets refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep you think you've dug the grave. The second trip to Thorn's penthouse felt like visiting a crime scene where the criminal was still at work. I rode the elevator up through layers of expensive security, knowing that somewhere in this fortress, Emily Vane had been playing the longest con in corporate history. The question wasn't whether she'd break when confronted, but how much damage she'd try to inflict on her way down. Vanessa was in her office when I arrived, seated behind a glass desk that looked like it had been designed by people who distrusted human comfort. She glanced up as I entered, her expression shifting into the professional concern that had fooled everyone for 8 years. But now I could see the performance for what it was, carefully calibrated and ruthlessly maintained. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, gesturing to a chair. "Any progress?" Marcus seemed quite shaken when he left. I settled into the offered seat, watching her face carefully. "We've made considerable progress. Turns out this isn't about security breaches or random threats. It's about old partnerships, stolen intellectual property, and people who spent a very long time learning how to be patient." Something flickered behind her eyes, too quick to identify, but definitely present. The mask was still in place, but I could see the effort it required now. "That sounds complicated," she said carefully. "Should I be concerned about anything specific?" "That depends," I said, letting the words hang in the air between us. "Do you have any old partnerships I should know about, Emily?" The silence that followed was absolute. She didn't gasp or deny it or reach for a phone. She simply looked at me with an expression that shifted from professional politeness to something far more complex. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but carried an undertone I hadn't heard before. "How long have you known?" "Since we found your father's equipment in the guest suite downstairs, along with correspondence showing recent emails to your address. Phase 2, complete," the message said. "Care to explain what Phase 1 was?" She stood slowly, moving to the window that overlooked Manhattan like a judgment throne. When she turned back, the 8-year performance was finally over. The woman facing me was younger, harder, and infinitely more dangerous than the efficient assistant who'd been managing Thorn's life. Phase 1 was making him understand that his fortress is an illusion, she said quietly. That everything he thinks he controls can be penetrated, manipulated, taken apart piece by piece. He spent 10 years believing he was safe behind his walls and his money and his carefully rewritten history. I wanted him to feel what my father felt when Marcus destroyed everything he'd built. Your father's alive then. Very much so, living quietly under a name Marcus would never recognize, working on projects that don't require him to compromise his principles for profit margins. He didn't die in that boating accident, Mr. Goodwin. He escaped before Marcus could finish destroying him completely. I kept my voice conversational, unthreatening. And the 3 years you spent in psychiatric treatment, was that part of the escape plan? Her laugh was bitter and genuine. That was Marcus exercising his legal authority over a grieving teenager who wouldn't stop asking inconvenient questions. I wasn't unstable. I was inconvenient. The doctors he hired were very good at diagnosing whatever he paid them to diagnose. By the time I got out, I'd learned to hide what I really thought and felt, useful skills as it turned out. She moved back to her desk, opening a drawer to remove a thick manila folder. She placed it carefully between us, her fingers lingering on it like it contained something precious. Marcus didn't just steal the encryption key, she continued. He stole patents, code, entire product architectures that my father developed. Then he systematically erased Julian Vane from the company narrative, rewrote the history to make himself the sole genius behind everything. This folder contains documentation proving my father's contributions, correspondence showing how Marcus eliminated him from the record, and financial documents demonstrating how he's profited from stolen work for a decade. You could have taken this to lawyers, the press, regulatory agencies. Lawyers work for people with money and power, Mr. Goodwin. Marcus has both in abundance. We have truth, which turns out to be worth considerably less in federal court than you might expect. So we decided to use his own methods against him. Infiltration, patience, systematic dismantling of his sense of security. And when he's sufficiently destabilized, we'll release everything publicly. Not for money. For acknowledgement. He needs to admit what he did. To my father, to me, to everyone who believed his version of history. I studied her carefully. This woman who'd spent nearly a decade living a lie to expose a larger one. And if he doesn't cooperate, if he fights back, uses his considerable resources to bury you and your father again, then things get considerably less civilized for everyone involved. Her expression hardened. I didn't want it to come to this, Mr. Goodwin. I would have preferred legal remedies, proper channels, civilized resolution. But Marcus doesn't do civilized when his empire is threatened. He does ruthless. So we learned to match him. My phone buzzed with a text from Wolfe. Bring her to the brownstone. Tonight. Tell her we have information about her father's current situation that requires immediate attention. I looked at Emily Vane, who was still officially Vanessa Croy, for a few more hours, and considered how much truth to deploy. Wolfe wanted her in his office, where he could control the environment and orchestrate whatever resolution he was planning. Getting her there required the right leverage. Mr. Wolfe wants to meet with you, I said. He has information about your father's current circumstances that he believes you need to hear urgently. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion and something that might have been fear. Why would Nero Wolfe have information about my father? Because when someone hires him to solve a mystery, he doesn't stop at the obvious answers. He keeps digging until he understands everything, including things his clients forgot to mention. What he's discovered about Julian Vane's situation is apparently urgent enough that he wants you there when he explains it. She studied me for a long moment, calculating risks and possibilities with the same methodical precision she'd used to infiltrate Thorne's life. Finally, she nodded once. I'll come. But if this is some elaborate trap, Mr. Goodwin, you'll discover that I learned more than just patience during those 3 years of treatment. I learned how to protect myself and the people I care about. Noted, I said, standing. We leave in 20 minutes. And Emily, bring that folder. Something tells me we're all going to need documentation before this night is finished. As we prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into the final act of a play that had been 10 years in rehearsal. The only question was, who would be left standing when the curtain fell? The ride back to the brownstone felt like traveling through a minefield where every pothole might trigger an explosion. Emily sat beside me, clutching that folder of evidence, her knuckles white against the manila cover. Watching the city slide past with the intensity of someone memorizing details for a final exam. When we pulled up to the familiar address, I noticed she hesitated before getting out, as if crossing the threshold into Wolfe's domain meant abandoning the last vestiges of the performance that had sustained her for 8 years. Fritz opened the door with his usual seamless efficiency, but I caught him studying Emily with the careful attention he reserved for ingredients that might be past their prime. He took our coats without comment, though his eyebrows conveyed volumes about unexpected dinner guests and the disruption of household routines. I led Emily directly to the office, where Wolfe sat behind his desk like a mountain that had decided to take a personal interest in human folly. Marcus Thorne was already there, occupying the red leather chair with the rigid posture of a man preparing for surgery without anesthesia. When Emily entered, the temperature in the room dropped perceptibly. These two people had shared the same space for 8 years, but they were seeing each other clearly for the first time, and the view was apparently not pleasant for either party. "Miss Vane," Wolfe said, his voice carrying the measured authority of a judge opening court. "Please sit. We have urgent matters to discuss concerning your father, your employer, and the elaborate deception that has brought us all together this evening." Emily took the yellow chair, positioning herself so she could watch both men simultaneously. The folder remained in her lap like a shield, though I suspected its protection was largely psychological at this point. "Mr. Goodwin said you have information about my father's current situation. I'm here to listen." Wolfe poured beer from the bottle Fritz had brought, the deliberate ritual giving weight to whatever revelation was coming. "Your father is in immediate danger, Miss Vane, not from Mr. Thorne despite their history, but from someone who has been manipulating this entire situation for his own purposes. Someone who allowed your vault penetrations to succeed, who enabled your access to secure areas, and who has been monitoring your communications with your father from the beginning." The folder slipped slightly in Emily's grip. "That's impossible. We used encrypted channels, coded messages. No one else knew about our plans." "Someone did," Wolfe said. "Someone with the technical expertise to intercept encrypted communications, the security clearance to access building systems, and the professional training to recognize an opportunity when it presented itself. Mr. Derek Moss has been playing a longer game than either of you realized." Thorne leaned forward, his face pale. "Derek? But he's been investigating the breaches. He's been trying to secure the building." "He's been managing the breaches," Wolfe corrected. "There's a significant difference. Mr. Moss discovered Miss Vane's true identity weeks ago, possibly months. Rather than expose her immediately, he allowed the charade to continue because it served his purposes. Every breach, every threatening message, every escalation increased your dependence on his security services and expanded his access to your systems." I watched Emily's face as the implications sank in. The careful planning, the meticulous execution, the sense of control she had maintained for 8 years, all of it had been observed, catalogued, and manipulated by someone who'd been 3 steps ahead from the beginning. "The dumbwaiter mechanism in your vault table," Wolfe continued, "was indeed designed by your father during the original construction. But Mr. Moss knew about it. He's had access to all architectural plans, all security specifications, all maintenance records. He could have sealed that access point at any time. Instead, he monitored it, waiting for the right moment to act." My phone buzzed with a text from Saul Panzer. I read it quickly, then looked up at Wolfe with growing alarm. "Saul's been watching Moss. He just left the Thorne building through the service entrance. He's not alone." Emily shot to her feet. "My father?" "Most likely," Wolfe said grimly. "Mr. Moss has what he came for, the master key and its creator. With both in his possession, He can disappear into any number of countries that don't maintain extradition treaties with the United States. The encryption key represents not just millions in potential profit, but leverage over every system built on Mr. Thorne's protocols. Thorne was already reaching for his phone. "I'll call the police, the FBI. We can stop him." "By the time federal authorities mobilize, Mr. Moss will be airborne," Wolfe said. "He's had contingency plans in place for months. Private airfield, untraceable aircraft, destination unknown. You have perhaps 30 minutes before he reaches the point of no return." Emily was moving toward the door, her 8-year performance finally and completely abandoned. In its place was something harder, more dangerous, a daughter whose father was in mortal peril and who'd spent nearly a decade learning to survive in hostile territory. "I'm going after him," she said, and the flat certainty in her voice made it clear this wasn't a request for permission. I was already grabbing my coat. "We're going after him. But Emily, Moss isn't just some corporate security chief. He's military intelligence, trained for exactly this kind of operation. He'll be expecting pursuit." "He's expecting corporate rivals and federal agents," she replied, checking something in her purse that looked suspiciously like it might not be legal to carry in New York City. "He's not expecting a dead man's daughter who spent 8 years learning how to be someone else entirely. People like Moss understand tactics and strategy. They don't understand what someone will do when the only person they have left in the world is taken from them." Wolfe's voice followed us to the door. "Archie, Mr. Panzer is coordinating with airport security to delay any departures. You have a narrow window, but it exists. Miss Vane, your father spent 10 years in hiding to protect both of you. Don't let his sacrifice be meaningless." As we headed for the Heron, I realized we were racing toward the final act of a play that had been 10 years in rehearsal. The only question was whether we'd arrive in time to change the ending or simply witness how thoroughly Derek Moss had rewritten the script to serve his own ambitions. The Manhattan traffic had never seemed more hostile, and the clock had never ticked louder. Traffic parted before the Heron like the Red Sea, though I suspected divine intervention had less to do with it than Emily's white-knuckled grip on the dashboard, and my willingness to treat traffic laws as suggestions rather than commandments. She sat rigid beside me, that manila folder clutched against her chest like armor, her eyes fixed on the road ahead with the intensity of someone willing the miles to disappear through pure concentration. My phone crackled with Saul's voice from the dashboard speaker, his updates coming in the clipped, economical phrases of a man who'd spent a lifetime making surveillance reports. "They're at Taterborough, private terminal, south side, Gulf Stream on the tarmac, engines warming, 2 security personnel, former military by their posture. Moss has your father, Miss Vane, but he's moving him slowly, carefully. The man's not restrained, but he's not moving voluntarily either." Emily's voice was tight with controlled panic. "How long before they can take off?" "Flight plans filed for Montreal, but that's misdirection," Saul replied. "Real destinations probably somewhere without extradition treaties. Airport security's stalling the departure authorization on Wolfe's instructions, but they can only hold for maybe 20 minutes without federal warrants." I swung around a delivery truck that had apparently decided the middle of an intersection was an excellent place for a coffee break. "What instructions?" "Mr. Wolfe's been busy," Saul said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "He's contacted the FAA, Customs, and 3 federal agencies I'm not supposed to know exist. Moss's travel documents just developed mysterious irregularities. His offshore accounts are being flagged for suspicious activity. The shell companies he's been using for operational funding are suddenly very interesting to the IRS." Emily turned to stare at me. "He's doing all that from his office?" "Wolfe doesn't chase people," I explained, taking a corner hard enough to make the tires complain. "He arranges for them to have nowhere to run. By the time we get there, Moss will be discovering that his carefully planned escape route has turned into a dead end." Taterborough Airport materialized out of the industrial landscape like a monument to the convenience of wealth. I parked in a zone clearly marked for official vehicles only, figuring we'd either be heroes or criminals within the hour, and parking tickets would be the least of our concerns. Saul emerged from the shadows near the terminal, moving with his characteristic economy of motion. "Status?" I asked. "Moss just received a phone call," Saul reported quietly. From the expression on his face, it wasn't good news. His pilot's been grounded for an emergency inspection. The fuel truck that was servicing his aircraft has been recalled, and airport security just informed him that his departure slot has been indefinitely delayed due to air traffic control complications. Through the terminal windows, I could see a sleek corporate jet sitting on the tarmac, its engines winding down from their previous urgent whine to a disappointed whisper. Near the aircraft stairs, Derek Moss stood with his hand on the elbow of an older man whose resemblance to Emily was unmistakable despite the years and the circumstances. My phone rang. Moss's voice was calm, but I could hear the edge underneath. "Goodwin, I assume you're responsible for my current difficulties." "Mr. Wolfe is a thorough man," I said. "He doesn't like loose ends, and he particularly doesn't like people who threaten his clients or manipulate his investigations. You've managed to do both. And what exactly do you think you've accomplished?" "I still have Vane. I still have the encryption key. A few bureaucratic delays don't change the fundamental equation." "They change it completely," I replied. "Without a clean exit route, you're not a professional operator conducting a strategic extraction. You're a kidnapper holding a hostage in a very public location with federal agencies taking a sudden interest in your activities. The smart play is to negotiate." There was a long pause. When Moss spoke again, his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone reassessing a situation that had shifted beneath his feet. "What are you proposing?" "Face-to-face conversation. You, me, Emily, and her father. On the tarmac. Everyone walks away with what they need most." "Which is what, exactly?" "You need a way out that doesn't involve spending the next 20 years in federal custody. Emily needs her father back safely. Mr. Wolfe needs all parties present for a final accounting of this mess. I think we can arrange something mutually beneficial." 20 minutes later, we stood on the windswept tarmac, the four principals in a drama that had been 10 years in the making. Julian Vane looked older than his photographs, worn by a decade of hiding and the weight of watching his daughter risk herself for his sake. But his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and when he saw Emily approaching, the recognition and love that washed over his face was painful to witness. Moss released his grip on Julian's arm, stepping back with the calculated movements of someone who understood that the tactical situation had shifted irrevocably. "The folder," he said simply. Emily held it out, but didn't let go. "My father first." Simultaneously, Moss countered. "I'm not stupid enough to give up my only leverage." What happened next was choreographed with the precision of a ballet. Emily and Moss stepped toward each other, the folder changing hands at the exact moment Julian moved to his daughter's side. For a heartbeat, everyone held their positions, assessing the new configuration of power and possibility. Then Saul's voice cut through the wind. "Mr. Moss, you have approximately 30 seconds to decide whether you want to walk away from this or be carried away from it. Federal agents are approaching the terminal, and they're not here for the coffee." Moss looked at the folder in his hands, then at the approaching lights of official vehicles, then at Emily Vane, who was holding her father like she intended never to let him go again. His shoulders sagged slightly as the mathematics of the situation finally resolved themselves. "Tell Wolfe I'll be at his office in 2 hours," he said quietly. "I assume he'll want to discuss terms." An hour later, we were back in the brownstone, Julian Vane sitting in the red leather chair, like a man who'd been underwater for 10 years and was finally learning to breathe again. Emily sat beside him, their hands clasped, neither willing to break the physical connection that confirmed they were both real, both alive, both finally in the same room. Wolfe entered from the plant rooms, surveyed the assembled company with satisfaction, and settled behind his desk. Fritz brought beer and coffee, then vanished with his usual discretion. The stage was set for the final act, and this time everyone would be present for Wolfe's characteristic dissection of human folly and the assignment of moral responsibility. The doorbell rang precisely at 9 o'clock. Derek Moss had arrived for his appointment with Justice, and Nero Wolfe was ready to receive him. Derek Moss entered the office like a man walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided, but the sentence remained negotiable. He moved with the controlled precision of someone whose survival had always depended on reading situations correctly, his eyes automatically cataloguing exits and assessing threats, even though he understood his tactical position had collapsed completely. When he saw Julian Vane sitting beside Emily, something flickered across his face that might have been regret or simply recognition that his carefully orchestrated plan had devolved into something far more complicated than anticipated. I guided him to the yellow chair facing Wolfe's desk, noting how he positioned himself to maintain sight lines to everyone present while keeping his hands visible. Whatever else Derek Moss might be, he wasn't stupid enough to make threatening gestures in a room full of people who already considered him dangerous. Wolfe surveyed the assembled company with the satisfied expression of a conductor preparing to lead an orchestra through a particularly complex finale. Marcus Thorne occupied the red leather chair with the rigid posture of a man watching his empire being systematically dismantled. Julian and Emily sat together, their hands clasped with the desperate intensity of people who had been separated too long and weren't willing to risk losing each other again. "Mr. Moss," Wolfe began, pouring beer with deliberate ceremony, "you have demonstrated competence, foresight, and a deplorable deficiency of judgment. You will not leave this house until I have a complete accounting of your actions and motivations." Moss settled back slightly, his expression shifting to the careful neutrality of someone preparing for interrogation. "And what exactly do you want to know, Mr. Wolfe? I assume my admiration for your methods isn't the primary objective here." "The truth," Wolfe replied simply. "In sequence, with omissions only when I deem them irrelevant. When did you realize that Vanessa Croy was Emily Vane?" 4 months ago," Moss admitted without hesitation. "I flagged anomalous network traffic routing through the guest suite. Once I traced it to that hidden equipment, connecting the dots wasn't difficult. The encryption methods, the architectural knowledge, the email patterns. Julian Vane might as well have signed his work." Emily's jaw tightened. "You could have exposed me immediately." "Why didn't you?" Moss looked at her with something that might have been respect. "Because what you were doing interested me professionally. I spent 20 years watching powerful men steal other people's work and call it innovation. You and your father had planned to hit one of them where it actually hurt. I admired the precision." Julian spoke for the first time since Moss had arrived, his voice carrying the weight of a decade spent in shadows. "Yet somehow you ended up kidnapping me and attempting to flee the country with my encryption key. That seems like a significant departure from admiration." "You built a weapon, Mr. Vane," Moss said flatly. "Thorne stole it. You spent 10 years hiding from the consequences. I saw an opportunity to take that weapon and direct it somewhere it could accomplish real change. Sell access to the right governments, the right oversight organizations, and you could reshape the entire balance of corporate power." Wolfe's eyes opened fractionally. "Moral posturing bores me when it accompanies simple theft, Mr. Moss. You discovered Miss Vane's operation, recognized its potential value, and began orchestrating events to position yourself as the ultimate beneficiary. Your rhetoric about systemic reform is decoration, not motivation." Thorne found his voice, though it came out hoarse with exhaustion. "Marcus didn't just force me out of the company, Mr. Wolfe. He threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent, to take Emily away permanently if I fought the dissolution. I had a choice between losing everything or losing only my work. I chose my daughter." The confession hung in the air like expensive cologne in a closed room, overwhelming and impossible to escape. Thorne's face flushed red as the implications of Julian's words settled over the gathering. "You were unstable," Thorne protested weakly. "The master key was dangerous. You wanted to release it publicly. Consequences be damned. I did what was necessary to protect the company." "You did what was necessary to protect your control," Julian corrected quietly. "And when Emily started asking questions about the partnership dissolution, about where the patents had really originated, you had her institutionalized. 3 years of her life, Mr. Wolfe. 3 years of being told she was delusional because she wouldn't accept your version of history." Wolfe turned his attention back to Moss, who had been listening with the careful attention of someone waiting for his moment to speak. "You allowed the vault breaches to continue because each escalation increased Mr. Thorne's dependence on your security services. The diagnostic sessions, the manipulated logs, the carefully timed system failures, all designed to demonstrate that external threats required enhanced internal control. The Estonian proxy routing was elegant," Moss acknowledged. "It suggested foreign adversaries while using my own administrative credentials. I needed to test how much remote access I could exercise without attracting attention." "Sloppy execution," Wolfe said dismissively. "You failed to account for human memory. Miss Santos heard voices where none should have been. The chef noticed his missing knife sooner than anticipated. And you underestimated Mr. Moore, Thorne's capacity for fear-driven action." The room fell silent as Wolfe arranged his thoughts with the methodical precision of someone preparing to deliver judgment. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of someone who had weighed all evidence and found the proper balance. "We are here because 3 men made choices that set irreversible events in motion. Mr. Thorne chose ambition over partnership. Mr. Vane chose disappearance over confrontation. Mr. Moss chose exploitation over ethics. Each believed circumstances justified his actions. Each was wrong." He paused to drink, letting the weight of moral assessment settle over his audience. "However, I'm not interested in punishment for its own sake. I'm interested in resolution that serves justice without creating additional victims." Moss leaned forward. "What are you proposing?" "Restoration," Wolfe said simply. "Mr. Thorne will publicly acknowledge Mr. Vane as co-creator of the encryption protocols that built his fortune. He will transfer appropriate compensation for 10 years of stolen credit and provide restitution to Miss Vane for the years stolen from her through false institutionalization. And in return, the master key remains secure. The documentation Miss Vane compiled will be held by a neutral party, released only if commitments are violated. Your company survives, your reputation takes manageable damage rather than complete destruction." Wolfe turned to Moss. "As for you, you will surrender the key to its rightful owner and cooperate fully with authorities regarding your unauthorized activities. In exchange, you will be permitted to leave the country using your carefully prepared transportation, provided you never return or contact anyone involved again." Moss considered this, his mind calculating odds and alternatives. Finally, he reached into his jacket and placed a small encrypted drive on Wolfe's desk. "Acceptable." The resolution came together with the satisfying precision of a well-made mechanism, each piece finding its proper place in the larger design. Justice was served, debts were acknowledged, and the brownstone's tranquility was restored. As Moss departed into the night and Julian and Emily began planning their future, Wolfe settled back with the contentment of someone who had successfully imposed order on chaos. The reckoning was complete, and dinner was waiting. The silence that followed Derek Moss's departure felt like the aftermath of a storm when the air finally clears, but everyone remains alert for distant thunder. Marcus Thorne sat rigid in the red leather chair, his jaw working as he stared at the encrypted drive on Wolfe's desk as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his carefully constructed empire. Julian and Emily occupied the yellow sofa together, their shoulders touching with the desperate intensity of people who had been separated too long and weren't quite ready to trust that their reunion was permanent. Wolfe arranged papers on his desk with the methodical precision of someone filing away a completed puzzle, but his attention remained focused on Thorne, whose composure was developing hairline cracks under the weight of impending accountability. When Wolfe finally spoke, his voice carried the measured authority of a judge preparing to deliver sentence. "Mr. Thorne, you are contemplating resistance to terms that represent your only viable path forward. I advise against such contemplation. The alternative to negotiated resolution is public exposure of documentation that would transform your corporate biography from success story to cautionary tale about systematic fraud and abuse of legal authority." Thorne's hands opened and closed on the chair arms. "You're asking me to dismantle the narrative that has sustained my company and my public reputation for a decade, to admit fraud, theft, and the institutionalization of a minor based on fabricated psychiatric evaluations. Do you comprehend what that would do to my position in the industry? Your position was compromised the moment Miss Vane infiltrated your household 8 years ago," Wolfe replied without sympathy. "I am suggesting a course that avoids complete implosion. You will sustain damage, certainly, but survivable damage. Consider the alternative. A federal investigation featuring your systematic erasure of a co-founder and the forced psychiatric treatment of his daughter. Corporations have weathered acknowledgement of past partnerships. They rarely survive revelations of criminal conspiracy." Julian leaned forward, his voice carrying the quiet exhaustion of a man who had spent his rage years ago and now sought only recognition of truth. "I'm not asking you to fall on your sword, Marcus. I'm asking you to stop standing on my back. Joint credit for the work we did together. Financial compensation based on documented contributions. Public acknowledgement that Thorne Industries was built on shared innovation, not solitary genius. We don't need your destruction. We need your honesty." Emily's gaze never left Thorne's face. "And an apology. Not drafted by your legal department or filtered through corporate communications. From you to me. In writing. For what you did when I was 16 years old and asking inconvenient questions about my father's disappearance." Thorne flinched at that demand more than at any financial calculation. It was one thing to negotiate percentages and public disclosures. It was another to confront the human wreckage buried beneath corporate success. His shoulders sagged as the full weight of moral reckoning settled over him. "I'll need to consult with counsel," he said weakly. "You may consult attorneys about implementation details," Wolfe corrected. "Not about whether you will comply. The framework is non-negotiable. Mr. Vane will be restored as co-founder in all corporate records and public materials. A compensation package reflecting his equity stake, with compound interest over 10 years, will be established within 30 days. Miss Vane will receive both financial restitution for her lost years and a formal, personal apology, acknowledging the injustice of her institutionalization. The master encryption key will remain under joint custody, with independent technical and ethical oversight." Thorne sat in defeated silence for nearly a full minute, calculating the mathematics of survival versus the cost of continued resistance. Finally, his voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Agreed. All of it. Julian gets full co-founder credit, financial compensation, and joint control of the key. Emily gets her settlement and her apology. The documentation stays sealed as long as I honor every commitment." Wolfe inclined his head fractionally. "Mr. Goodwin will draft the framework agreement. Your attorneys may argue over subordinate clauses to their heart's content once the essentials are established in writing." Julian stood slowly, moving to Wolfe's desk where the encrypted drive sat like a small monument to a decade of betrayal and revenge. He picked it up, weighing the device that contained enough computational power to reshape global information security. For a moment, he simply held it, This object that had cost him his partnership, his public identity, and 10 years of his daughter's life. This represents immense power, he said quietly. In the wrong hands, it could dismantle banking systems, compromise national communications, render privacy obsolete. Derek Moss understood its potential, even if he misunderstood his entitlement to control it. "What will you do with it?" Emily asked. Julian looked at his daughter, then at Thorn, and finally at the fireplace where a small blaze crackled against the evening chill. With sudden, decisive movement, he tossed the drive into the flames. The plastic casing hissed and melted, sophisticated electronics surrendering to elemental destruction. "The knowledge remains with us," Julian said, watching the fire consume the object that had been both treasure and curse. "But the temptation ends here. We'll build our future on something more substantial than secrets and the power to violate other people's privacy." Thorn watched the flames destroy the source of his greatest fear and his most coveted prize. When he finally looked away, something like relief flickered in his eyes. The fortress had fallen, but perhaps the man inside could survive without walls built on stolen foundations. After the principals departed, Thorn to begin the humiliating process of rewriting corporate history, Julian and Emily to reclaim a future that finally belonged to them. The brownstone settled back into its customary tranquility. I collected empty beer bottles and straightened chairs, restoring order to a room that had witnessed the dismantling of an empire and the resurrection of a family. Wolfe remained behind his desk, eyes closed, lips pushing in and out in the rhythm that signaled deep contemplation. I knew better than to interrupt his post-case analysis, but silence has never been my strongest virtue when loose ends are dangling like untied shoelaces. "So Moss escapes clean," I observed, settling into the red leather chair. "New identity, offshore accounts, probably enough resources to live comfortably somewhere that treats extradition requests as amusing suggestions." Wolfe opened his eyes. Mr. Moss recognized that his position had become untenable and negotiated a strategic retreat. Justice is not always punitive, Archie. Sometimes it involves removing destabilizing elements from the equation. He will not return. His survival depends on permanent anonymity, and he values survival above all other considerations. And Thorn keeps his billions, his company, and most of his reputation. Doesn't feel like justice for what he did to Emily. Mr. Thorn retains his material possessions, yes, but he loses the illusion of control that sustained his sense of invulnerability. He must now operate knowing that his success is shared, his history is corrected, and his actions are monitored by people who understand his capacity for moral compromise. For a man of his temperament, forced humility represents punishment more severe than incarceration. He will spend the remainder of his career explaining partnership to people who believed his mythology of solitary genius. Fritz appeared in the doorway with impeccable timing, announcing that dinner was served. Wolfe's expression brightened with the genuine enthusiasm he reserved for matters of true importance. The great mass of him rose from his chair and moved toward the dining room with surprising grace. "Cassoulet," Fritz announced with obvious pride, "with the duck confit I prepared last week and vegetables from this morning's market." Wolfe halted, turning to me with profound satisfaction. "Archie, the universe may be chaotic, human nature may be irredeemably flawed, and justice may require compromise with imperfection. But a properly prepared cassoulet represents absolute good in a world of relative values. Let us eat." We settled at the dining room table as the events of recent days receded into memory, replaced by the immediate reality of Fritz's culinary artistry. The case of the Tycoon's hidden fortress was closed, filed away in the archives of human folly alongside gardenias, knives, secret rooms, and stolen lives that had all played their assigned roles in the drama. I watched Wolfe tuck his napkin into his collar, his attention focused entirely on the steaming casserole dish Fritz placed before him. For Nero Wolfe, The world beyond the brownstone remained a necessary inconvenience, a source of fees required to maintain the sanctuary where orchids bloomed and meals achieved perfection. He had ventured forth metaphorically, rearranged the lives of powerful people, and restored balance to a small corner of the universe. Now he was returning to the only things that truly mattered. "Archie," he said, pausing with a forkful halfway to his mouth, "you may send Mr. Thorne an itemized bill in the morning. Include surcharges for disruption to my digestive schedule and the psychological strain of hosting armed fugitives in my office." "Consider it done," I replied, sampling Fritz's masterpiece. "Maybe I should add a line item for narrator's hazard pay, considering I spent 3 days wondering if the ghost in the machine was planning to kill us all." Wolfe grunted, which could have indicated agreement, dismissal, or simple appreciation for the cassoulet, and devoted himself to the serious business of dinner. The fortress was secure, the secrets were properly buried, and in the dining room of the brownstone on West 35th Street, everything was exactly as it should be. The city outside continued its noisy, chaotic existence, full of ambitions and betrayals and secrets waiting to be uncovered. But inside, under the warm light of the chandelier, there was only the gentle clink of silverware, murmurs of appreciation for Fritz's genius, and the comfortable silence of two men who understood that while they couldn't fix the world, they could at least ensure that dinner was served on time and justice was served with appropriate seasoning. I took another bite of the cassoulet. It was, as always, perfect. And for tonight, that was enough. The files could wait until morning, the orchids would need their afternoon attention, and the world would continue spinning on its axis. But right now, the only mystery worth solving was whether there would be enough for seconds. Knowing Fritz, the answer was yes. Knowing Wolfe, the competition would be fierce. Another case closed, another meal begun, another day in the life of Nero Wolfe, who sat in his chair like a Buddha contemplating the infinite foolishness of humanity while drinking beer and occasionally imposing order on chaos through pure intellectual force. Life in the brownstone went on, exactly as it should. 3 weeks after Marcus Thorne's empire had been surgically dismantled and reassembled with proper attribution, I was sitting in the office on a Thursday morning, engaged in the pleasant task of reconciling a bank statement that showed more black ink than red for the first time in months. The case had been lucrative in ways that went beyond the substantial check Thorne had written. It had also generated referrals from 3 other tech moguls who suddenly wanted their own security arrangements reviewed by someone who understood that the real threats usually came from inside the fortress walls. Wolfe was upstairs communing with his orchids. Fritz was in the kitchen preparing something that smelled like it belonged in a French palace, and the brownstone had settled back into its customary rhythm of controlled chaos and deliberate comfort. I was just finishing the deposit calculations when the doorbell rang, with the tentative uncertainty of someone who wasn't quite sure they deserved to be there. Emily Vane stood on the doorstep, and the transformation was remarkable. Gone was the severe corporate armor of Vanessa Croy, replaced by jeans, a soft blue sweater, and hair that looked like it had been styled for comfort rather than intimidation. But the most significant change was in her eyes, which no longer carried the careful calculation of someone maintaining a decade-long performance. She looked, for the first time since I'd met her, genuinely at peace. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, offering a smile that reached her eyes, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything crucial." I led her to the office, noting how she moved with the relaxed confidence of someone who no longer needed to monitor every gesture for potential exposure. When Wolfe descended from the plant rooms at 11 o'clock sharp, she was settled in the yellow chair, looking more like a visitor than a co-conspirator. "Miss Vane," Wolfe said, arranging a spray of dendrobiums in his desk vase with the reverent attention most people reserve for religious artifacts. "I trust the transition to authentic existence is proceeding satisfactorily." "Better than I expected," she replied. "My father and I have found an apartment in Brooklyn Heights. Nothing fancy, but it's the first home we've shared since I was 16. He's consulting with Columbia on encryption ethics, teaching graduate students about responsible innovation. It's work he believes in, without the corporate compromises that destroyed everything the first time. Wolfe poured beer, the ritual providing structure to what was clearly more than a social call. And Mr. Thorne has honored his commitments. Every single one, Emily confirmed, reaching into her bag to produce a thick envelope. The public announcement went out last week. Full co-founder credit for my father, acknowledgement of his contributions to every major innovation, even a formal corporate apology for the historical revisionism. The financial settlement cleared yesterday, and the Joint Oversight Committee for the Encryption Protocols meets next month. She handed me a letter written on expensive stationery in Marcus Thorne's distinctive handwriting. I read it twice, struck by its complete absence of legal hedging or corporate euphemisms. It was a personal apology that acknowledged specific wrongs without attempting to minimize or justify them. This surprised me, Emily continued. The money and public recognition were negotiated terms. But this letter is something else entirely. It's him actually confronting what he did instead of hiding behind settlements and non-disclosure agreements. I passed the letter to Wolfe, who read it with the careful attention he usually reserved for rare orchid specimens. Mr. Thorne has discovered that genuine accountability requires more than financial compensation. He is attempting to reconstruct his moral foundation after learning that his previous structure was built on quicksand. He's been meeting with my father regularly, Emily said. Not for business, just conversation. They're working through what happened 10 years ago, trying to understand how a partnership became a betrayal. It's not friendship, probably never will be, but it's honest dialogue between two men who've both made serious mistakes. The office fell quiet, except for the gentle ticking of the clock and the distant sound of Fritz's culinary preparations. I watched Emily's face as she spoke about her father, noting the absence of the rigid control that had characterized Vanessa Croy's every expression. "What about you?" I asked. 8 years of living someone else's life doesn't just disappear because the performance is over. Emily's laugh carried genuine humor instead of bitter irony. I'm in therapy, real therapy this time, not the kind designed to make me compliant with other people's narratives. Turns out spending your 20s planning elaborate revenge isn't particularly conducive to psychological health. Who could have predicted that? Wolfe's eyes opened fractionally. Revenge provides the illusion of purpose while deferring the more challenging work of healing. You have chosen the more difficult, but ultimately more rewarding path. My father and I are learning how to be family again, she continued. 10 years apart, with me believing he was dead and him watching from hiding as I sacrificed everything to avenge him. That creates complications we're still working through. We love each other, but we're also strangers rebuilding a relationship that was interrupted when I was still a child. She stood, moving to the window that overlooked the street where ordinary people conducted ordinary lives without the burden of decade-old conspiracies. I came here to thank you, Mr. Wolfe. Not just for solving the case or negotiating the settlement, but for seeing past the revenge plot to what we actually needed. Justice, yes, but also the possibility of moving forward instead of remaining trapped in the past. Wolfe inclined his head slightly. I am not a therapist, Miss Vane. I simply arranged for appropriate consequences to follow inappropriate actions. The healing is your responsibility and your achievement. After she left, the office settled back into contemplative quiet. Wolfe returned to his correspondence, but I caught him staring at the closed door with an expression that suggested satisfaction tempered by philosophical reflection. She'll be all right, I observed. Emily, I mean. She's tougher than her circumstances suggested. She survived institutional abuse designed to break her will, then maintained a false identity for 8 years in the household of her father's betrayer, Wolfe replied. Her resilience was never in question. The question was whether she could redirect that strength toward construction rather than destruction. It appears she can. I thought about the various players in our recent drama, and how each had been transformed by events. Marcus Thorne confronting his capacity for cruelty. Julian Vane rebuilding a relationship with his daughter, Emily choosing therapy over continued revenge. Even Derek Moss disappearing into whatever exile he'd arranged for himself. "You know what strikes me about this case?" I said. "It started with a single gardenia in a sealed vault. Simple, elegant, theatrical. But it unraveled into kidnapping, encryption keys, decade-old betrayals, and multiple lives shaped by one bad business decision. Yet it all came back to that flower and what it represented." Wolfe marked his place in the day's correspondence with a thin gold strip. Human beings construct elaborate fortresses to protect themselves from consequence and accountability. Archie. They install security systems, hire guards, build walls both literal and metaphorical. Yet invariably, the threat emerges from within. Mr. Frere. Thorne's vulnerability was not external penetration, but internal rot. His fortress fell because its foundation was compromised from the beginning. "Deep thoughts for a Thursday afternoon," I observed. "Practical observations about the nature of security," he corrected. "True protection comes not from walls and weapons, but from the knowledge that one's actions can withstand scrutiny." Mr. Thorne learned this lesson expensively but thoroughly. Fritz appeared in the doorway with perfect timing, announcing that lunch was served. Wolfe's expression brightened with genuine enthusiasm as he rose from his chair and moved toward the dining room with surprising grace for a man of his dimensions. The case was closed, the files were properly organized, and life in the brownstone continued its comfortable rhythm. Outside, the city churned with its usual chaos of ambition and betrayal, but inside these walls there was order, routine, and the satisfaction of having imposed justice on a situation that had festered for a decade. I smiled, thinking about Emily choosing therapy over revenge, and Marcus Thorne writing apologies by hand instead of delegating them to corporate communications. Maybe people really could change when properly motivated. Or maybe we'd just been fortunate to catch them at the precise moment when growth seemed preferable to continued self-destruction. Either way, it made for a satisfying conclusion to a case that had begun with flowers and ended with the possibility of genuine redemption. In Nero Wolfe's world, that represented the highest achievement available to those who dealt in mysteries, motives, and the eternal human struggle between what we want and what we deserve.